Imagine waking up at 55 on the first Monday of your retirement. No alarm screaming at 6 a.m., no traffic, no meetings, and no boss waiting for you. For the first time in decades, the entire day belongs to you. It feels like you've beaten the system and bought back 10 years of freedom. But there's a side of retiring at 55 that almost nobody imagines on that first peaceful morning. Leaving work 10 years earlier doesn't simply mean paying for 10 extra years of retirement. It can mean 10 fewer years of paychecks, 10 fewer years of retirement contributions, earlier portfolio withdrawals, a long healthcare gap, and more pressure on your money to survive decades without employment income. And one bad assumption can turn that dream into a very expensive mistake. So before you decide that 55 is your freedom number, there's one question you need to answer. Can your retirement survive everything that happens after the paycheck stops? Chapter 1. The Retirement Dream Versus. The retirement math at 55. Retirement can feel like the perfect escape. You're young enough to travel, active enough to enjoy the freedom you've spent decades working toward. And suddenly, your calendar belongs to you instead of your employer. Compared with waiting another 10 years, retiring now can feel like buying back the healthiest and most valuable decade of your life. But retirement math sees those 10 years very differently. When you leave work at 55 instead of 65, you're not simply adding 10 years of freedom. You're potentially giving up 10 years of salary, workplace retirement contributions, and additional compounding while asking your existing savings to start supporting you much sooner. The decision changes both sides of the equation at exactly the same time. Imagine two people with identical portfolios at 55. One retires immediately and begins withdrawing money for living expenses. The other continues working, keeps contributing, and allows the portfolio another decade to potentially grow before depending on it for income. By 65, those two financial pictures could look dramatically different, not because one person invested more intelligently, but because time was working in opposite directions. Then comes the part many early retirement calculations underestimate. Health insurance must be covered before Medicare eligibility for most people. Social Security may still be years away, and a market downturn becomes more dangerous once you're withdrawing instead of contributing. Suddenly, one decision at 55 affects income, healthcare, taxes, investments, and cash flow all at once. None of this means retiring at 55 is a bad idea. For someone with the right plan, it can be one of the best decisions they ever make. But the real question isn't simply whether you have enough money to quit. It's whether your money can survive the financial chain reaction that begins the moment your paycheck stops. And the first part of that chain reaction is bigger than most people realize. Those 10 extra years of freedom have a price, and it's not just 10 years of living expenses. Chapter 2. The 10 years you have to buy yourself. Retiring at 55 doesn't just mean you need enough money to cover 10 additional years before 65. The financial impact is much bigger than that, because you're changing two sides of your retirement plan at the same time. The moment you stop working, money stops flowing into your retirement accounts, while money may start flowing out. And that shift can completely change how long your savings need to last. Imagine two people who are both 55 with the same retirement balance. One retires today, while the other continues working until 65. The person who keeps working potentially gets 10 more years of salary, 10 more years of retirement contributions, possible employer matches, and another decade for existing investments to compound without being tapped for everyday living expenses. The early retiree faces the opposite equation. Instead of adding money, they may need to begin withdrawing it for housing, food, travel, insurance, and everything else life requires. Those withdrawals don't just reduce the account today. They also remove money that could have remained invested and potentially compounded for years. That's the hidden cost most people miss when they calculate the price of retiring early. This is why the difference between retiring at 55 and 65 isn't simply 10 years of expenses. You're effectively buying 10 years of freedom while giving up 10 years in which your paycheck and compounding could have continued doing much of the financial heavy lifting. That doesn't mean working until 65 automatically wins. Money can potentially be rebuilt, Healthy years cannot always be replaced, but if you want those 10 years back, your retirement plan has to be strong enough to purchase them without putting the next 20 or 30 years at risk. And before you calculate that price, there's another bill waiting between you and 65 that can be far harder to predict than groceries or travel: healthcare. Chapter 3. The healthcare gap nobody budgets correctly. Retiring at 55 creates a problem that doesn't appear on most retirement vision boards: health insurance. When you leave a job, you may also leave behind one of your most valuable employee benefits. And for many early retirees in the United States, Medicare generally doesn't begin until 65, which means retiring at 55 can leave an entire decade of healthcare costs that must be funded somehow. This is where people often make a dangerous budgeting mistake. They estimate a monthly insurance premium, add it to their retirement expenses, and assume the problem is solved. But premiums are only the entrance fee. Deductibles, copays, prescriptions, dental and vision care, out-of-pocket limits, and coverage for a spouse or dependents can turn healthcare into a much larger and less predictable expense than expected. Imagine retiring with a portfolio that looks perfectly adequate based on your normal living expenses. Then insurance costs rise faster than expected. A medical issue creates several years of higher out-of-pocket spending, or family coverage costs significantly more than your original estimate. Suddenly, money that was supposed to fund travel, housing, and everyday life is being redirected toward healthcare, forcing larger withdrawals from the same portfolio you need to survive for decades. The real danger isn't simply that healthcare is expensive. It's that the cost can arrive during one of the most financially vulnerable periods of early retirement, when your paycheck has disappeared, but Medicare and other retirement income sources may still be years away. That doesn't make retiring at 55 impossible. It means healthcare cannot be treated as a footnote in the plan. You need a realistic bridge, room for costs to rise, and enough flexibility to absorb surprises without immediately damaging the rest of your retirement. Because even after solving the healthcare gap, there's another risk no budget can schedule in advance. What happens if the stock market crashes just after you retire? Chapter 4. The first market crash after you quit. Imagine two people retiring at 55 with exactly the same $1 million portfolio, the same spending needs, and the same long-term investment strategy. On paper, their retirement plans look identical. But during the first few years, one experiences a strong market while the other retires just before a major downturn. 20 years later, they could end up with dramatically different amounts of money. The reason is something called sequence of returns risk, and it becomes especially dangerous when you're no longer earning a paycheck. When markets fall during your working years, you can often keep contributing and give your investments time to recover. But when you're retired, you may still need to sell investments to pay for groceries, housing, insurance, and everyday life, even while those investments are temporarily worth much less. Imagine the second retiree watching a $1 million portfolio fall sharply during the first year or two. They still need income, so withdrawals continue while the portfolio is down. Those withdrawals permanently remove shares that can no longer participate in the eventual recovery. Even if the market later delivers strong long-term returns, the damage caused by selling early in a downturn can follow the portfolio for decades. Meanwhile, the first retiree experiences positive returns early. Their portfolio grows before major withdrawals have had time to weaken it, creating a larger cushion for future downturns. Both retirees could experience similar average returns over many years, yet the order in which those returns arrive can produce completely different outcomes. That's why retiring at 55 isn't simply about reaching a magic portfolio number. A strong early retirement plan also needs flexibility, whether through cash reserves, adjustable spending, diversified income sources, or another strategy designed for difficult markets. Because the most dangerous question isn't, what return will my portfolio average? It's whether your retirement can survive if the worst returns arrive first. Chapter 5. Your 401 may be large, but can you actually use it? Imagine reaching 55 with $1 million in your 401. On paper, you look financially independent. Your spreadsheet says you have enough. Your investments have done their job. But then comes a question many people don't seriously consider until they're preparing to leave work. How exactly are you going to turn that account balance into spendable income? Generally, taking taxable retirement money before age 59 can trigger ordinary income tax and an additional 10% federal tax unless an exception applies. One important exception is commonly called the Rule of 55. If you separate from service during or after the calendar year you turn 55, distributions from a qualifying employer plan may avoid that additional 10% early distribution tax. But avoiding the penalty does not automatically make the withdrawal tax free. Here's where one seemingly routine decision can matter. The separation from service exception applies to qualified employer plans, but not to IRAs. So someone who immediately rolls eligible 401 money into an IRA may discover that the Rule of 55 no longer applies to withdrawals from that IRA. And even when the tax exception applies, your specific employer plan controls what distribution options are actually available. So checking the plan documents before making irreversible moves is critical. This reveals a distinction that can make or break an early retirement plan. Net worth is not the same as accessible cash flow. You could be a millionaire on paper while much of your wealth sits inside retirement accounts, home equity, or other assets that require careful planning to access efficiently. That's why retiring at 55 requires more than asking, do I have enough? You also need to ask, which money will I spend first? How will I access it? And what taxes or restrictions will that decision create? Because once the money is accessible, another surprise appears. Retirement itself may cost far more than the peaceful lifestyle you pictured. Chapter 6. The costs nobody puts in the retirement fantasy. Most people imagine retirement as the moment their expenses finally start falling. No commute, no work clothes, fewer lunches out, maybe the mortgage is already paid off. On paper, it seems logical that leaving work should make life cheaper. But retiring at 55 creates something you may never have had before, an enormous amount of free time. And free time has a way of becoming expensive. Think about what you actually want to do with those extra years. Travel while you're healthy enough to enjoy it. Visit family more often. Play golf. Take up new hobbies. Renovate the house. Eat out. Or finally buy the things you postponed while working. None of these choices are necessarily irresponsible. In fact, they're often the entire reason someone wants to retire early. But they can make the first decade of retirement surprisingly expensive. Then come the costs nobody puts on the retirement vision board. A roof needs replacing. An adult child needs financial help. Aging parents suddenly require support. A car dies earlier than expected. Insurance premiums rise. Property taxes increase. And inflation quietly pushes the cost of groceries, utilities, travel, and everyday life higher year after year. This creates a strange retirement paradox. You finally have the freedom to enjoy your money at exactly the moment when you need that money to last longer than ever. Imagine building your entire plan around spending $60,000 a year, only to discover that your real lifestyle consistently costs $75,000. That extra $15,000 isn't just one bad year. If it becomes permanent, it means larger portfolio withdrawals, less money left invested, and greater pressure during every future market downturn. That's why a strong retirement plan shouldn't be built around the cheapest version of your future. It should account for the life you actually intend to live, plus enough margin for the expenses you cannot predict. Because retiring at 55 isn't about proving you can survive without a paycheck. It's about making sure you can still live the life you retired early to enjoy, without spending the next 30 years afraid of running out of money. And that brings us to the question everything has been building toward. After healthcare, market crashes, account access rules, inflation, and unexpected spending, is retiring at 55 actually a bad idea, or can it still be one of the smartest decisions you ever make? Chapter 7. So is retiring at 55 actually a bad idea? So after everything we've uncovered, is retiring at 55 actually a mistake? No. For the right person with the right plan, retiring at 55 could mean gaining 10 valuable years of freedom, while you still have the health, energy, and time to enjoy them. But reaching a certain age or hitting a certain portfolio number doesn't automatically mean you're ready. The person who succeeds in early retirement isn't necessarily the person with the biggest 401. It's the person whose entire financial life works together. They know where their income will come from before Social Security, how they'll handle healthcare before Medicare, which accounts they'll access first, how taxes could affect withdrawals, and what they'll do if the market falls during their first few years without a paycheck. Most importantly, they have margin. Their plan doesn't require perfect markets, perfectly predictable expenses, or perfect health. They have enough flexibility to reduce spending when necessary, enough accessible money to avoid desperate decisions, and enough room for life to surprise them without immediately putting the entire retirement at risk. That's the real difference between simply quitting work at 55 and being financially prepared to stay retired after 55. So ask yourself one final question. If you knew you had enough money to retire at 55, but not enough margin to survive one bad decade, would you still walk away from work, or would you buy yourself a little more security first? If this video helped you think differently about early retirement, like the video, share it with someone planning their own retirement, and subscribe, because the next question may be even more important. If you do retire at 55, your next challenge begins the moment that final paycheck arrives. Surviving the financial dead zone between leaving work and the retirement benefits that may not become available until years later. And that gap is where even a retirement plan that looks strong on paper can begin to break.